What's going on, everyone? This is Tyrone May here, Himalaya ride enthusiast and entrepreneur. I'm back here once again as I bring you chapter 12 of my book, The Himalaya, where the strobe flash and the mirror ball spins. Continuing my story about my fascination with the Himalaya rides and how it started, and which leads me to my journey to one day call one of those classic rides of my very own. So if you'd like to purchase your copy, you can get it on Amazon or my online store. We can also get some Himalaya fan base merch, as you can see here. Web address is shown below the screen. So, without further ado, I will give you chapter 12, titled, It's a New Record. During my drive home from spending some time at the mall trying to recover from my experience at the fair, I glanced out of a window of the top of my Himalaya model, which I'd completely forgotten about. As soon as I returned home, I rushed over to the back of my car and immediately opened the trunk. I realized that I had left my model in there for too long. Several straight hours of drawing, cutting, and taping piece by piece of my prized model was completely flattened by the constant beating of the scorching July sun. I was horrified by the sight. I couldn't believe that I left my hard work in that car for so long. I took the remains of my ruined model inside and started to take it all apart. Nothing could be fixed or salvaged except for the mirror ball, the two small flashlights that I had used to shine on the ball, and the white string of lights that were used for the boarding lights. Every part that I made, from the scenery to the cars, had to be disposed of, so I had no choice but to start all over again. But instead of trying to build a newer and better model, I decided to take a month off the job hunt. I got a job at the local roller rink during the early fall. There I met a lot of new people and learned a lot of new things that I would take with me throughout my years. The job gave me a whole new perspective on life and how to handle certain situations. During my free time, I couldn't help but think about creating my next new Himalaya model. So I grabbed some of my usual materials and went to work. I decided to take my time with this one by working on it a few hours a day instead of trying to complete it in one whole day for several hours straight. Thanks to my experience at working with the real deal, I had some new ideas for this new and improved Himalaya model. I became more creative in making parts for the ride structure by taking pieces of my special white cardboard paper that I've been using to build my Himalaya models since I first started, which was the only material I knew how to use to build my models. I took a piece of that cardboard paper and cut into strips of various sizes and lengths, and then folded them to each into thirds like a triangular shape. The pieces made part of the model structure. I made a lot of these parts and taped them all together to form the ride structure. It looked damn near perfect, I must say. A few things were a little different on this particular model. The scenery panels for the inside were just white background with a mountain scene that I had sketched with a blue marker, which didn't look as appealing as the traditional background artwork I was used to seeing. But I figured it was the latest trend for the newly built Himalaya rides. It was the same with the rotation of the giant mirror ball. This time I didn't use the three-wheel device so the ball could spin in the opposite direction as the cars, which I hadn't done in such a long time before I discovered how to make the ball rotate in the opposite direction. After the new scenery panels were in place and all the new cars were made, the model was complete a few days later. My model went through some more changes during the holiday season when every department store was selling Christmas lights. I finally found a way to have the Himalaya sign light up just like the real thing. So I bought 2 sets of the red lights and 1 set of white lights. The red lights were used for my sign and some decorative panels that were under the sign. I took the idea from the Himalaya Trippers Amusement Park in Ocean City, Maryland. Though they were built differently, I had to find some way to give use to the access lights on both strands. I poked holes in the lettering of my sign and then put the red lights through the holes. I used 1 set of red lights for every other hole on the sign lettering and then used the other set of red lights for the rest of the holes. When I inserted the flash bulbs on both sets of lights, it gave the sign and the outside panels a nice effect. I took the time to design some new light posts for the outside of the model by using red gels I purchased at a theatrical store. I cut them out in the proper triangular shape of the light posts, and then put them all together with the structure I had made with the cardboard paper. The new string of white lights were placed inside each of the red posts, which were now attached to the front and sides of the model. I even purchased a new mirror ball, which was a tad larger than the ball I normally use, but it fit really well with my model. What a spectacular sight it was when it was all completed, and I couldn't have been prouder of myself for what I accomplished. That following year, 1998, my model went through more changes during the early spring when I purchased a pocket-sized strobe light that I attached to the back of my model. I also bought some miniature speakers to put inside instead of using one of the big speakers from the part of the boombox I used for music. Normally I use a detachable speaker and put it to the side of the model, but now it has its own set of speakers. I also purchased a small spinning disco light from a nearby flea market to add some color effects to the model. I also took the time to build a stand for the light. I designed it with a slight angle so the light could aim toward the inside of the model. The only thing that this model was missing was a cool siren effect, which was still hard to find. I happen to have a few DJ catalogs that sold sirens, but the problem was the price of the siren ran about $75, and it would be too loud to use for such a small model. My plan was to record the sound on a cassette tape, but I wasn't going to spend a large amount of money for something I would only use once. I decided to wait until I met someone who was a DJ and had a siren, so that way I could borrow it to record the sound. About 4 months went by with no luck, so I had no choice but to get a siren of my own. Later that spring, I went to the same theatrical store where I bought the red gels. It happened to sell DJ equipment and lighting as well. I found a $50 siren, which in my opinion was a better bargain than $75. I purchased a siren and took it home to record the wailing sound on a blank cassette tape. I played it back on a Walkman that was hooked up to a small speaker that was attached to the back of the model. As soon as I turned up the speed of my model and played the cassette tape with the sound of the siren, I knew right then and there that my work was officially complete. I worked on my model so much during the first half of 1998 that summer quickly returned and the state fair was just a month away. 2 days before the fair started, I decided to drive down to the fairgrounds to have a sneak peek of the Midway. When I looked at all the rides, I noticed the Himalaya was there, but it was in a different spot for some reason. When I looked closely, I saw that the Top Spin ride was in the same spot as the Himalaya was sitting during last year's fair. I then realized that the two rides had switched spots with each other. After my sneak preview of the fair, I grabbed some lunch at a nearby Hardee's and headed back home. Later that evening, Aunt Christine paid us a visit around 6 o'clock, which was the same time when the daily news started. Every year during the time of the state fair, there was a news report about amusement ride accidents. The reports never sat well with me because I have always loved amusement rides and I never liked to hear anything negative about them. But that year, things started to take a turn for the worse for me when I heard about a report about an accident that took place on the Himalaya ride at another carnival. I was devastated when I heard the report. This can't be, I said to myself. This can't be real. This cannot be the same Himalaya ride that I know and have loved ever since I was a kid. When they showed the ride on television, it felt like someone had planted a bomb and everything had stood for it and just blew it up into millions of pieces. You hear that? My mother yelled at me, simply because she always got a kick out of busting my chops. She and my aunt sometimes double team me, basically because they know how much I can't stand it. My mother decided to add more fuel to the fire. She told me that because of the accident, I should forget about the fair in the Himalaya. I firmly told her that was out of the question. Nothing had changed when it came to going to the fair, and nothing would. I would continue to visit our fair just like I had done all these years, and I would continue to have strong feelings about the Himalaya. Even though I had taken a sharp blow hearing about that unfortunate accident, I would never, ever turn my back on the Himalaya rides as long as I lived. That kind of thing should not have happened on such a wonderful ride, let alone any other type of ride anywhere. My dream of having a Himalaya ride of my very own grew even stronger than ever before. And after hearing what had happened at that carnival, I took an oath to learn how to take care of a Himalaya ride sometime in my future before I ever owned one. I decided that when it did finally happen, I would ask for all kinds of manuals or anything of that matter, just so I could learn how to take good care of it for years to come. I also felt that if I had owned that ride at that carnival, that accident wouldn't have happened in the first place, and the girl would still be alive. My condolences go out to her family. Early that Thursday evening, I made my way back to the fairgrounds. It was opening night of the fair. The fair itself started around 7 o'clock, but I decided to leave the house an hour earlier to beat the heavy traffic. On my way to the fairgrounds, I arrived early enough to grab some dinner at a nearby McDonald's in Harrington. After filling myself with a Big Mac and fries, I headed back on that busy road on my way to the fair. I finally arrived at the fairgrounds after an hour of sitting in a long line of other vehicles waiting to park. I got out of the car, stretched my legs, and started heading toward the Himalaya, which was sitting in this new spot. The Thunderbolt and Enterprise were also in some weird spots. However, the Music Express was in its usual place, as were many other rides that were there. I had hoped to see Terrence, Daryl, and the rest of the old gang again, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. There were a few new people running the ride when I arrived, but other than that, the Himalaya still looked pretty good and well maintained. As I looked closely at the cars, I noticed that they all had newly printed blue number stickers on them, which were in a fancy design. Another thing that was different on the cars was that every other seat was changed from red to blue. It was kind of an interesting look for a Himalaya ride, but nonetheless, the ride was there and I couldn't be happier. I left for a minute to buy some tickets to ride and ran into Charles, the supervisor, who was very happy to see me. Charles asked me if I was ready to work at the Himalaya again, but I told him as tempting as it was, I decided to sit this one out and just enjoy the ride. Hell, I was still recovering from the previous year. Charles snickered after I gave him my answer. He then told me that Goose was also over at the Thunderbolt ride and I should go see him. I went over to the Thunderbolt and noticed something different about the ride itself. It was up and running like normal, but there was no loud music playing. Goose was in the control booth operating the ride, and I waved to him. After he stopped the ride and unlocked the lap bars so everyone can get off, he came by and greeted me. I asked Goose why there was no music playing on the ride. He told me that Big Tree had all the stereo equipment for the ride, and he had finally left the carnival for good. As he waited for some more customers to board his ride, he asked me if I wanted to hop on. I reached in my pocket and grabbed some tickets, but he stopped me and told me that it was okay because he still considered me as part of his crew, even though I wasn't working for him that year. After I got in one of the swinging cars, Goose started the ride right after the familiar sounding bell was rung. It felt so strange riding the ride without music. I mean, the Thunderbolt with no music was pretty much like peanut butter without jelly. After the ride was over, Goose asked me if I was on my way back to the Himalaya. I told him I was about to start heading back over there, so he told me to tell the workers that I still worked for him and it was okay with him for me to ride. So I went back over to the Himalaya where I got in line and watched the ride while waiting for my turn to hop on. After it was over and everyone cleared the ride, one of the workers who was collecting the tickets opened the rope for the next load of screaming thrill seekers. As I approached the worker, I told him that I used to work for Goose and he told me to tell him that it was okay for me to ride. So after the worker gave me the okay, I walked down the platforms where another worker showed me to my seat. It felt so good to be on that ride again. I looked around and noticed that the two disco lights were still there, but there was only one spotlight, which was hanging right over the giant mirror ball. As the ride started, I held on for dear life because I knew how fast this particular Himalaya went. The ride sped up seconds later and the siren began to wail. The operator sped up the ride about 3 times. After the siren wailed one last time, the ride finally started to slow down and then came to a complete stop. As I got off the ride and headed down the stairs, I ran into my good friend Tim, who was paying the ride a visit. We chatted for a minute or two. As I was leaving the Himalaya for an hour or so to buy tickets on some other rides, Tim was suddenly back up in the booth operating the ride and rocking the music just like every year. The music he played was up to date. In fact, the music was so good that I saw some of the people from my high school having some sort of dance contest in front of the ride, which I thought was interesting. The Himalaya always had that kind of festive atmosphere. I mean, there was the giant spinning mirror ball, the disco lights, and the strobe light that was now hanging in a different spot than usual. The strobe light wasn't in the tunnel, which was its usual spot. Instead, it was hanging in front of the ride between the two disco lights that flashed very brightly. Half of the string of the white boarding lights kept going out, especially when Tim played with the switch, turned them off and on every time he sped up the ride. After taking a gander at the little dance competition that was going on, I went up the stairs and climbed back on the ride. I suddenly ran into my cousin Tony, who decided to join me when he spotted me going up the stairs. I invited Tony to sit with me, but he insisted that we get separate seats, which was more than okay with me. After the ride was filled, Tim started the ride as the boarding lights went out and the mirror ball spotlight came on along with the two disco lights. I waved to Tim as I passed by going into the tunnel. As the ride got faster, Tim entertained the speeding crowd. The mirror ball spotlight went out and the strobe light came on along with the siren. Tim flashed the white boarding lights as the sleigh cars flew around the undulating track. Though I really value my experience working at the Himalaya, it felt great just to be on the ride and enjoying myself. After the ride was over, I went down the stairs. Tony rushed over to me and grabbed me by the shoulder and told me how great the Himalaya was. He now realized why I loved the ride so much. After Tony went back to his friends, I decided to call it a night. I waved goodbye to Tim and went over to the Thunderbolt and talked to Goose before I left. During a long walk to my car, a lot of personal issues suddenly came to mind. Away from the noisy Midway, I thought about all the guys I had seen from my high school. I noticed how much fun they all had when they were hanging out together, which was something I personally never had a chance to experience. Ever since I left all my friends in Dover back in '92, I found it really hard to find any friends who would give me a time of day, except for Tommy, who I hadn't seen since the previous summer. The more I thought about it, the lonelier I became. But I wasn't going to let it stop me from having a great time, especially since I could finally drive to the fair myself and ride the Himalaya as many times as I wished. But at the same time, I wish I could have had someone with whom to hang out and scream on the rides. I returned to the fair after work that Saturday evening, and as usual, I ended up going solo. I actually had a better time than the first night I had gone because I spent the majority of the evening riding the Himalaya and talking to Tim when he was on break. I still wish I had someone with whom to hang around, but then again, I had the Himalaya, and I knew I could ride it as many times as I wanted, so what could be better? I stayed at the fair until it closed later that night, and as I left the Midway and walked toward my car, I had nothing but the Himalaya on my mind. The next morning, after a good night's sleep, it was time for me to go back to my job at the roller rink. I was supposed to start my shift at 1 o'clock that afternoon, so I thought. As soon as I arrived, my manager told me that I was scheduled to come in earlier that morning because the camp had just rented the rink for a private party. I felt like a deer in headlights because this news was totally unexpected. The last time I had looked at the schedule, there was nothing going on that morning. Thankfully, my manager told me that someone had come in and taken over, so everything turned out all right. That little situation may have killed my mood, but I kept going as soon as I started my shift. Plus, I was looking forward to going back to the fair that next day. I had the whole day to myself because I wasn't scheduled to work, and it was also the day of the special wristbands. Before I went to the fair, I visited my godbrother Richie. I told him I was on my way to the fair, and he asked if he could tag along with me. By all means, I answered with a smile on my face. I finally had someone with whom to hang out and scream on the rides. Plus, I knew he also liked to ride the Himalaya, which made it even better. We arrived at the fair around 4 o'clock that afternoon, and as we walked over to the main gate to pay the admission, I spotted another familiar face. I happened to run into grumpy old JR, who used to work at the Thunderbolt with me, but on this day he was helping out with the special wristbands. "Hey, what's up?" he yelled while shaking my hand as I paid for my wristband. I told JR what I'd been up to as we chatted. As soon as Richie and I received our wristbands, we went straight over to the Himalaya, where Tim was working the crowd as usual and talking on the microphone. Richie and I immediately got in line before it started to stand and watched the ride in motion. As the siren wailed one last time, the ride slowed down and came to a stop so everyone could safely clear the ride to make room for the next load of riders. We stood in line eager to hop on board. As soon as the first worker unhooked the rope, we rushed up the stairs. One of the other workers waited for us and showed us to our seats, which happened to be in front of the booth where Tim was working. I waved to Tim as I said hi. He said over the microphone, "Hey, what's up, man?" During our first visit on the ride, Tim put on his next song choice, which was "Come With Me" from the Godzilla soundtrack, which was the main song that we heard during the first 4 times we went on the ride, because he had played that song in heavy rotation throughout the whole day. After our 5th time on the Himalaya, Richie and I went over to the Silent but Fast Thunderbolt ride. It felt weird riding it without music, but the thrill was still there. Richie liked the Thunderbolt so much that he wanted to ride it again. As for me, I was ready to return back to the Himalaya until suddenly we both thought up this crazy tag team kind of game in which Richie would ride the Thunderbolt while I rode the Himalaya, and then as soon as our ride was over, we would switch rides. This game went on about 5 times, which meant that we had ridden the Himalaya 10 times so far that day, and it was still early. Richie and I decided to take a break and walk around the Midway to ride some other rides at the fair. As we walked down the Midway, I noticed there was something different about the Music Express ride. There were workers on the ride, but no one was riding it and there was no music playing, which I thought was very odd. Usually the Music Express was full of life, just like the Himalaya. But on that day, the ride was surprisingly closed for some unknown reason. Even though I was loyal to the Himalaya, I couldn't just stand there and just look the other way. I went up to the Music Express and tried to ask one of the workers what the situation was with the ride, but they wouldn't give me any kind of answer. Instead, it just gave me the brush off. He basically told me just move along. I just couldn't understand it. The ride was in perfect shape and there was no news of an accident or anything of that nature. The Music Express just sat there, cold, quiet, and empty. The sun went down a few hours later and the Midway dazzled with its many lights. The entire fair and Midway were getting congested. We made 2 more trips back to the Himalaya. First I went on by myself while Richie rode with one of his female friends. We then decided to ride again, but this time Richie's friend had another friend who sat with me. When the ride reached its full speed, I looked over at the girl who looked like she was about to get sick. But thankfully she didn't, because that would not be a good experience for me or my good clothes I was wearing that night. After the 12th time on the Himalaya, Richie ran into some of his other friends and suggested that we split up for a while so he could spend some time hanging with them for a couple of hours. I told him that was cool with me and to meet me back over at the Himalaya afterward. While Richie went off with his friends, I went back to the Himalaya for my 13th visit. When I got on the ride, the crowd was thicker than before and the line was even longer. But the music Tim was playing, well, let's just say he played music that normally wouldn't be played on such a high energy ride. He was actually playing some opera music. Yes, I said opera out of all music categories. Usually Tim plays some off-the-wall stuff like this when some unruly customer starts pestering about the music he plays. He would abruptly change the usual music he normally plays to something out of the ordinary. But even though opera was blasting from the ride sound system, it didn't stop the crowd from running the ride. In fact, the line grew even longer than before, so Tim had to start giving out shorter rides so the wait wasn't as long. After my 14th time on my favorite ride, I decided to take another stroll around the fully lit Midway to ride some other rides. I ran into a few old friends along the way. First, I ran into one of my female friends named Angie, who I had met during the previous year while working at the fair. I asked her how she had been the past year as we talked for a minute. She told me that she had been doing okay and she was there hanging with her family. I also asked her if she knew anything about the Music Express and why it wasn't open. Angie had no idea what was going on with that ride. To this day, it's still a mystery. After talking to Angie after all this time, I asked her for her number so we could stay in touch. After we exchanged numbers, we hugged and said our goodbyes before I continued on with my night. While walking down the Midway, heading toward the Music Express, Sharice's boyfriend Raheem spotted me and asked me if I saw the Himalaya. Yes, I said, and told him about my experience working there during the previous year. As I continued walking down the Midway, I looked over at the Music Express and noticed that all of its lights were on, but there was still no music or no riders. I couldn't help but feel sorry for not only the ride, but for the workers who weren't making any money the whole day. During my walk around the Midway, I happened to run into my friend Todd, who used to live across from me when we lived in Felton with Aunt Christine. Todd invited me to hang out with him for a while and get on a few rides. So far, my night was turning out pretty good. In fact, too good. When Todd and I decided to go over to the Enterprise, everything took an ugly turn. We stood in line for about 45 minutes before finally making it to the front of the line. We were part of the next load to ride. At this point, Todd discovered how everyone was positioned to ride, which was one person behind the other. So in Todd's little dirty mind, he decided to protest to me that he didn't want to sit on the ride with me. Instead, he wanted the girl to sit with him. Well, damn, Todd, I said to him. I understand where you're coming from, but I want to ride too. And don't forget, you invited me to hang out and ride with you. I was better off as I was, so if you decide to ride with someone else, you had better find somebody to ride with me. Because right now you're just wasting my time, as well as other rides standing behind us. The thing is even worse, the worker who was checking tickets and armbands was the same guy I had dealt with at last year's fair when he suggested, demanded that I take off my damn hat. Now here's another kicker. Instead of placing the single riders together, which would have been okay with me, he decided to make them leave after standing in line for hours. At the same time, Todd suddenly spotted one of his female friends and called her over to ride with him, totally forgetting about me. Todd and the girl walked up the stairs to ride, leaving me high and dry. He then had the audacity to ask me to stay there and wait for him, which was like pouring salt on an open wound. "Are you on crack?" I screamed in an angry voice. I flipped him the bird and told him to go to hell as I stormed off. I was furious about what had happened with someone who was supposed to be my friend, so I decided to go back over to the Himalaya to cool off. As I went over to the ride, I noticed that Tim had changed the music back to his normal playlist. I guess either Tim thought everyone had suffered enough, or he had gotten sick of the opera himself. Either way, I was glad the music was back to normal. As I went in the back of the line, I spotted Richie at the front of the line. He asked me to join him, but I decided to stay where I was. And besides, the line wasn't too long. I was going to be the next ride after him. Actually, I found out that I wasn't that far from him, after all, because there was still enough seats left, and I ended up getting on the ride at the same time as Richie. At the same time, I started to feel a lot better about what had happened between Todd and me. This was the night when the Himalaya started to become my comfort ride. I began to forget all about what happened over at the Enterprise with Todd. As I rode the Himalaya for the 15th time that night, I forgot all about my worries as I lost myself while coasting rapidly up and down the undulating circular track while watching the mirror balls sparkle with cast tons of snowflakes all over the place. Suddenly, the millions of swirling white light beams from the mirror ball turned into sharp, bright flashes from the strobe light. The Himalaya accelerated into its fullest speed and the siren wailed over the loud bass-filled music. While riding the Himalaya at that very moment, I finally reached to the point that I just didn't really care anymore about not being able to ride the Enterprise, let alone any other ride. I was just thankful that the Himalaya was there, especially during the time I was in need. Besides the Himalaya, nothing else mattered to me that night because it was the last hour of the fair, and neither Richie and I were ready to leave, so we both walked around Midway one last time and then went back to the Himalaya for our final ride of the year. When we went back to the Himalaya, Tim was still jamming with the latest music, and we spotted a few of our mutual friends who were hanging out in front of the ride. After taking a minute to chat with everybody who was there, Richie and I went up the stairs where there wasn't really a line and got back on the Himalaya one last time. Once the ride got started, the mirror ball and disco lights came on, and Stop Being Greedy by DMX played on the ride sound system. Personally, I had hoped to catch that song while I was on the ride, and it couldn't have happened at a greater time. It was a perfect ending to my night. The fair closed a half an hour later, but I wanted to stay and talk to Tim some more before I left. As we waited for Tim, Richie had to tie his shoes, so we sat down on one of the benches. Minutes later, I spotted one of the other workers from the Himalaya having some sort of altercation with a woman who happened to be his wife. She was giving him quite a rough time, and they continued to make a scene right in front of us. After that shouting match, the woman walked away to cool off. The guy looked over at me as he walked by and suggested that I never get married, or else I would regret it. I told him that marriage was not on my agenda at this point, as I snickered. Finally, I spotted Tim as he checked to make sure everything on the ride was turned off. Rich and I went over to Tim. I talked to him for a minute and we exchanged numbers, hoping to hang out someday since I know now he was local. Tim mentioned that he rarely goes anywhere, but he would definitely give me a call someday. Before we left, we went over to the Thunderbolt, where Goose was shutting down his ride. I told him that it was good to see him again as we shook hands one last time. He told Richie that it was nice to meet him and hoped to see us again the following year. We walked out of the Midway to take that long stroll to our car. During the whole time we were at the fair, we spent most of our time on the Himalaya. I had ridden it a total of 16 times, which was a new record for me. Now that I think about it, I feel that I should have received some kind of prize that evening. And there you have it. That was Chapter 12, my book. Hope you enjoyed it so far. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and let me know what you think. And if you'd like to buy my book, of course, you can buy it on Amazon or my online store, along with tons of Himalaya fan-based merch. I'll be back on here next month with Chapter 13. So, as we say in the Himalaya world, keep the mirror ball spinning. Take care.